Welcome to Inspiring Honesty. I am your fill-in co-host. I'm Christopher Maute here with Bob Greaves, and we are going to be talking about a topic that Bob has no idea what I've brought to the table. I've brought something that hopefully we'll be able to chew the fat about for the next 45 minutes. And so, Bob, how you doing over there?
Doing pretty good. Doing pretty good.
Okay. Good. What I wanted to bring to the table today was a discussion about a topic that you're probably going to hear as being thematic in my show, which is the diversity amongst the atheist population or the atheist movement or the contingency that would call themselves atheists. And I'm going to specifically focus on an article that's been floating around the atheist websites and the atheist forums that I'm a part of. And it's a CNN article having to do with hold on one second. It's a CNN article having to do with the 6 different kinds of atheism based on a new piece of research.
Huh.
So I'm curious to get your opinion about what's going on. Um, so what they break it down into is they let's see if I get the research right. And the best part is I was actually able to get in touch with the people who did this research, and I'm actually going to have one of them on my show in the month of October, I think.
Great. Cool.
But I wanted to bounce it off of you. So they have they did a cohort of one-to-one qualitative interviews with people who regarded themselves and self-identified as atheists. And from those qualitative interviews, I think that they came up with a questionnaire. And the questionnaire was sent out to over 1,000 people. And the results of this study are the results of the questionnaires that they received back from those 1,000 or so people that they sent it out to. So they've broken down atheism into 6 different types, and if you don't mind, I would just like to go over them super quickly.
Sure.
One of them would be the intellectual atheist. Another would be the activist atheist. Another would be the seeker agnostic. And I can give you explanations to these if you'd like. The anti-theist is another type, a 4th typology. And the non-theist. And then finally, the one that I find interesting, the ritual atheist agnostic. So I can only assume that the people that were doing this research, and of course the research, if you follow the links, which I like to do when I see a science story in popular media, I always see if I can find the original link to the research that they're trying to tell me about. Not that I distrust science writers, but it's just a habit of mine. And the people doing the research are based out of a University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Department of Psychology. One of the researchers is an undergraduate. One of them is a graduate student and also a board member at the Chattanooga Free Thought Association. So he's interested in looking at demographic information from an atheistic perspective and kind of splitting hairs about who makes up the atheist community, if there is such a thing, or the non-believers, because I think that he's under the belief that they're misrepresented in most of the demographics that we have in the social sciences, because they kind of fall into a lump monolithic category.
Right.
That's a misnomer. So just based on the information I've been giving you so far, do you have any initial thoughts or opinions about the research?
No. Other than how did they randomly select the participants, or they're just people who self-identified, or
Well,
how they select?
they had to be self-identified. I don't know how they solicited it. 59 personal interviews. I actually have the data right in front of me, so I will see what I can do about
Yeah.
finding very quick answers.
Most
I don't
people think and assume that an atheist is an intellectual atheist. And that's
exactly.
possibly because that's the one they end up talking to the most. The non-theist is usually a quiet person, I would think, and they just don't say anything, and so you would know unless you really push the issue with them or something. But
Hmm.
I would just think that it sounds normal to me that you're going to have all sorts of different personalities who end up in this conclusion and express it in a manner congruent with their personality.
Hmm. Um, well, I think the one thing that they also did a little bit data mining. Unfortunately, I don't have any information on how they recruited their participants. But I also, with over 1,100 participants nationwide contributing to the current data analysis, no, he doesn't.
Do you think
He does.
we could also categorize believers in an almost identical six set of, you know, you got the theological, intellectual theists, you've got the activists, the people who are out to win the world.
Sure.
Uh,
That
you've got the people who are on some sort of spiritual quest. Uh,
well,
uh,
I don't know. Some people would say that, in general, the tacit behavior of Christians would be that of an activist, right? At least from an atheist's perspective, and feel free to jump in and let me know where I'm wrong. But
Is
um,
that I think that's interesting because I think that just as atheists are not well understood by theists, so I would wonder if it's the same the other way around. I know plenty of people who would identify as Christians that if you didn't ask them,
mhm,
they would never identify it. And a lot of people go to church, they just always have. They just assume a belief and they don't even know what their church believes.
sure.
You might, and for example, I know plenty of Episcopalians, and you say to them, for example, well, what do you think about baptismal regeneration? And their answer would be, what? They have no clue that the Episcopal Church has a position called baptismal regeneration. Hey, they don't even know what
Mhm,
you're talking about. That's because they just go there. It's part of their community. They believe they connect with other people there, and God gets mentioned, and isn't that wonderful?
sure. Sure. I think that you're right. I think that there is like a way to overlay the six categories that have been introduced on atheists and applying them almost like a template onto certain kinds of theists, because obviously not every theist or every denomination of Christianity are going to the forums and engaging in
No,
debate. And so,
right.
and of course, not every kind of atheist is. But interestingly, as far as the atheist breakdown, they do have some breakdown statistics that I thought were a little bit revealing. Of the people that they sampled, um, the majority of them fell into the academic atheist category, which kind of gives them the feeling that maybe that large category can be further subdivided into categories based on maybe feelings on epistemology and things like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting, but there's still a pretty high percentage of these ritual atheists, the people who still engage in ritualistic things to enrich themselves. Like, it might be yoga, it might be group meditation, but they still consider themselves atheists. Um, and I think that that's an interesting group to explore. Because they might not have the most firm beliefs in maybe what they think, and they're engaging in behaviors that just feel good to them. And I think what the authors say about them
Yeah.
is that the ritual atheist agnostic holds no belief in God or the divine, or they tend to believe it is unlikely that there is an afterlife with God or the divine. They are open about their lack of belief and may educate themselves in various aspects. Um, and they participate in tradition and ritual. For
Hmm.
instance, ceremonies, musical opportunities, meditation, yoga classes, holiday traditions, and stuff like that. Which makes me think that these categories are a little superfluous. Like as an atheist, I might fall into one of these categories more so on a certain day, depending on how I feel, than I fall
Right.
into that category on another day because I celebrate holidays. So does that make me a ritual atheist or
So
an
there might be
academic
a
atheist?
level of modality to them,
Sure,
you know.
sure. So I just thought it was an interesting piece of data because I think part of the stigma, at least in the United States, of even being called an atheist, is the fact that atheists might be represented in such a way, and this is something that we talked about earlier in my show today with my guest Gary, is how the media portrays atheists, and it usually picks the atheists that have the most strident opinions to represent the position, and
Makes for a
actually,
better news story.
exactly. It really does, because people with moderate opinions, I don't think people are as interested in watching and listening to.
Right.
But I would like to prove them wrong with my show at least. Um, the they have also information about, and I would like to get into details. This is something I'm going to ask them more about when I do have them on my show. But um, talking specifically about the fact that atheists have a bad reputation, and it is a little bit of a stigma to be called an atheist, at least in our culture. Um, they did do an analysis where they gave out personality tests to all of the participants,
Hmm.
and they ranked which groups scored highest and which groups scored lowest on these personality variables. And the point that they're making is the misrepresentation of atheists really falls within the anti theist category. So, for instance, the anti theists, or the people that self rated or fell into the anti theist category, seem to rate highest in things like autonomy, lowest in things like positive relations with others, highest in narcissism, highest in dogmatism, highest in anger inventory, and lowest on openness to experience.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's not. I'm sorry. That last one was incorrect. I misread it. And lowest on agreeableness.
Yeah. There's one fellow, I can't think of his name, who you see on YouTube. He's an atheist, and he is very hostile and very belittling, and I think sometimes he makes some excellent points, but he seems to wear us. You're more aware of his attitude than you are of his point of view.
Okay.
I can't think
Do
of
you
his
remember
name,
his
but
name? No. Is he American or English or?
I'm not sure. I don't think he has a British accent, so I
Okay.
think he's American or Canadian perhaps.
Oh,
But
okay. Yeah, I see a lot of that, and that's something I think the anti-theist movement is kind of born out of a lot of what we talked about earlier today, which was the new atheist movement. And I don't know how much you and Greg have had a chance to talk about that, but I was curious to know, like, because of your experiences in your path, how you kind of saw the ebb and flow of um, the atheist community, if you can call it that, which is
mhm.
I'm reluctant to even call it that, but just for the sake of discussion, let's call it that. And its ability to kind of galvanize itself over the past couple of years with all of the associations and think tanks and organizations that have been popping up. Um, how how have you been perceiving such activities?
Mostly that most I'm a college professor, so I run into a number of atheists. But most of them are what you might call just non-theists.
Okay.
They're so busy with what they're doing, they don't even stop very often to give the issue much thought, and they don't usually organize around this focus. But there will be a few who might do that. In fact, even in the science department at the college where I teach, we have people who are both theists and atheists in that department. Uh, and of course, the one thing they hold in common is a great respect for science, and as a result, not not traditional beliefs according to what fundamentalists would like, but there's sometimes discussions going on there, and sometimes even debates presented for student activities. But for the most part, it's been very easygoing that I run into, and
Mm-hmm.
for example, even I was part of an organization called the Center for Contemporary Spirituality, and we had a Buddhist scholar who didn't really talk about what he personally believed. We had a a professor of philosophy who was at that time head of the philosophy department at SUNY Binghamton, and who was Jewish in background but was atheistic. And then I was the kind of the Christian representative. But we just had wonderful conversations. It was awesome,
I'm sure.
and so it wasn't even a hostile thing. I do think that in the past I've run into more of the intellectual atheist in forums. Back when America Online was the rage.
Okay.
I'd run into a lot of them there because a lot of them would actually come into either Christian, um, uh, forums, or they would become part of forums where that might be a relevant counterpoint. And you'd run into them. So the intellectual atheist and the anti-theist would be the ones you would mostly run into. In terms of activists,
Mm-hmm.
um, very few activists, and some of them, I don't know if you can even call them activists, even if they just participate in a few activist activities. I mean, for example, we had here on the show here with us, I'm trying to think, David Silverman,
Yes.
and now he is. You could call him an activist, but he has a method and a purpose to the activism he has, and then there's a sense in which I get the impression his purpose is to make activism no longer even necessary, but just he sees it as a stepping stone towards it being a merely accepted and non-issue.
Well, it's funny
So
that you should bring up David Silverman because I happen to think that he's one of the poorer examples of atheist representation. Um,
yeah, we've had him on here on the show, and I wouldn't even know which category here to put him into. He didn't strike me as being anti-theist.
well,
He certainly,
he thinks the world would be better. He thinks that churches do cause damage, right?
yes,
And he has a very general definition of what churches are, um, a very wide definition of what churches are. So I mean, he kind of struck me as being a little anti-theist. I have to admit, he's
yeah,
definitely activist.
yeah,
He just
and
seems.
it may be that when he was on our show, he was respectful enough that he didn't really come across as anti-theist.
I hear you.
And that's my only experience of him. I've never
Hmm.
seen anything else that he does. He just was on the show with us one day.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I've seen other things. I've seen other things, but I mean, the fact that he's I believe president of American Atheist, an American
right.
atheist, and he's like the go-to guy, it seems, for when like Fox News or other outlets need an atheist to talk about something having to do with atheism. I mean, I've seen David Silverman on the O'Reilly Factor and other shows like that. And
Yeah.
of course, being on the O'Reilly Factor, I can see why he would be agitated if I perceived him that way. But he does seem to be, in general, just a little agitated. I guess the best way that I describe it is I believe that atheism needs bulldogs. I think that David Silverman fulfills that role. I just don't want to be that bulldog.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
I think there's a role that each of these would play. We and I could see how each of them would be. In whenever you have a society and a culture, uh, there are going to be various different ways that people are experience an impact, and some people are just not going to be touched by one of these, but might by the other in terms of any kind of interaction.
hmm And so I was curious. I mean, so you're saying that you didn't really notice an impact, like let's say after 9/11, when the new atheism movement seemed to really kick into gear with the publication of the Hitchens book and the Dawkins book and the popularity of Sam Harris and Dan Dennett. You didn't really see a change in the landscape with the onset of such a strong rallying cry for atheists, so to speak, with the four horsemen.
No, I really didn't. I personally, I didn't notice it. I saw these books, and I even saw a lot of the YouTube videos. But for me personally, I didn't know whether these things were just simply being brought to my attention, or if they were new on the scene. I didn't really even stop to think about it. I liked the God delusion. I thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
I thought a lot of good points were made in it. Um, there's and I've seen some of these these videos and other things that they're doing, and they certainly don't seem to be suffering any you know they're not suffering religious privilege much. They seem to be having a strong following. And gotta be honest with you, I think I've seen I've seen Richard Dawkins sometimes in a debate with a particular mathematics professor, I think it was, where I thought he did he did a far better job because the mathematics professor was much more traditional, and I'm not traditional, although I am a theist. So that I just didn't. To me, perhaps it was that the traditional theists just didn't hold water for me
Mm-hmm.
either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And another thing that I was curious about is now you mentioned in a previous conversation, I think it was this past Wednesday at Cult of Honesty when we were recording. Did you say that you were back in the 70s? You were fundamentalist?
Oh yes, yeah. Oh yeah. I was a bang the Bible against the pulpit, preach you into hell. God can't stand the stench of your sin, and you'd better come to the blood of Jesus if you don't want to fry forever. That was definitely the position I was in. And I look back at and it's almost embarrassing. But in fact, I really see that appealed to me so much, really, in many ways, because I could identify with the tone of that kind of faith because it was in a sense very similar to the kind of emotional abuse I was raised in.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so it was kind of like home to me.
And so the kind of apologetics that you were learning in that kind of fundamentalist movement, I mean, did you have opportunities to engage with atheists back in the 70s? Like,
Rarely,
I mean, were they
back in
was
the
there?
70s, there are very few atheists who would admit they were atheists. If you ran into them, they wouldn't tell you.
Okay.
It was extremely rare. And I do think that there was far more bias and prejudice against atheists back then, so that it probably wouldn't have been wise for too many of them to identify as such.
Mhm.
Didn't see it a lot, but there were people who at least spoke like skeptics, although they wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as atheists necessarily.
Gotcha.
And
Gotcha.
we're using books like Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and More
Sure.
Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I don't know if you've
Mhm.
ever seen them.
Oh, and evidence. Well, I saw evidence that demands a verdict because a very good friend of mine, who's going to be on my show in 2 weeks, he had a born again experience, and when we were in our early 20s, and he wanted to convert me, and he mailed me a copy of Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and I read it cover to cover, and he and I had the most heated argument after I finished that book because I approached it from my naive perspective, and he approached it from his naive perspective, and we just locked horns like only friends could. And of course, we're now still very good friends, best friends. But I can't wait to talk to him about that experience. But yeah, Josh McDowell, evidence that demands a verdict and more evidence that demands a verdict. And doesn't he have a son that's also in the apologetics movement?
I have no idea. I really kind of left the fundamentalist movement in about 1982. I kind of distanced myself from that.
Okay.
It came to the point where it just fell apart for me. And I would say that I don't think this is true of all fundamentalists, but for me, I was naive and ignorant. I wasn't aware of the facts that actually create conflict and dissonance with their position. I was just simply given their position, and I took it from there. That these people they say they love God, they love the Bible, they love this and this, so, and they say this is what's so, and they explain the text this way, and okay, there you go, and so so it wasn't until I had become acclimated to the paradigm and began to start really thinking for myself and say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense with that, or how could this be? Is that right? Is that even fair? Well, but that doesn't make sense. It wasn't until later that these questions start coming, and part of it was because I was a pastor,
Hmm.
and people would come to me, because they think that pastors are somehow experts at helping people with their problems, and
Hmm.
and I don't know that they are. They'd like to be, but I found that I as a pastor I really did want to help people, and I found that the kind of advice I was giving them just wasn't working and didn't make sense, and I found myself really questioning it, and I found myself very disturbed with what struck me as its ineffectiveness. And oddly enough, one person who was very significant in my abandoning fundamentalism was Randall Terry. I don't know if you know who he is.
I'm sorry, I don't.
He was the leader of that anti-abortion organization. uh, you know, uh, the right to life and all that other stuff.
Tall,
And
tall gentleman with a mustache.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
Randall
think I
Terry.
know who you're talking. I think was he in the movie Jesus Camp?
I don't know. I
If
didn't
if you
see the
if you've
movie
even seen the
myself. I
movie,
saw
I don't know.
clips of it, which were just horrifying to me. But Randall Terry was, uh, Operation Rescue. It was his
Yes,
organization.
that we are talking about the same person, I think.
Yeah. And he actually got his start right here in my area. And he visited my church and asked me if I would become a part of that organization. And while he was asking me that, various different women who were members of my church would come to me and talk to me about their own concerns and their own issues with abortion, and hoping that I would get involved. So I said, well, and I never jumped into anything without, trying to get by that time, I'm already asking questions. So I decided I would look into it. And to make a long story short, from the research that I did, I came up to the conclusion that probably 50% or greater of the people getting abortions, even in my area, were born again, Bible believing Christians who didn't want to get caught in the scandal. And so my response was, no, I find this too hypocritical. If you want to really curtail the frivolous abortions, then the people who say they don't believe in it should just stop having them,
Hmm.
and you can cut the abortion rate right in half right there. And I
Hmm.
refused to get involved. At the same time, I was being asked to get involved with an organization called Citizens for a Decent Community. And this was an anti-porn organization. And I went to a few of their meetings because I thought I'd give it a shot, see what's going on. And I got to tell you, the feeling I got in these meetings was that these were people who were porn addicts, and they really wanted to get porn off the shelves because that was the only way they thought they could stop buying it themselves. And I said, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. It's just not right. And so,
So
uh,
if it's not available at all, then they won't indulge in it themselves.
they're just trying to manage themselves by pretending they're trying to help other people. And to me, it was so dishonest. I just couldn't do it. And it was at that time that I was coming to the point where I felt I'm a part of a movement that is so disingenuous, that for a person who really wants to genuinely believe, even in my naivete, the kinds of things I believed, I just found it was failing in integrity, and it just began to unravel and fall apart for me. You know, now it didn't destroy my faith, but it certainly destroyed my perspective.
Mm. Mm. That is an interesting story. Um, and and you said in '82 is when you essentially left the fundamentalist movement behind.
Right. When I even began identifying myself as not only a non-fundamentalist, but as a person who was very much disenchanted with that movement and was, no longer um, a friend to it.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
in leaving it, you weren't leaving it on good terms.
I was leaving it as a new enemy of the movement in a sense,
Okay.
maybe the anti-fundamentalist.
Oh, sure, sure. That fits. That fits very well with like a little pet theory that I have, which is like you certainly aren't an apostate. You didn't go from believing to not believing, but you went from a certain style of believing to not believing in that certain style to the
Correct.
point
Yeah.
where you rejected that style altogether. And I think that in the same sense that when people have a very strong faith and then they drop it and become an atheist, and sometimes they become new atheists or militant atheists or anti-theists. Sometimes it's an interesting dynamic when a strong faith, when you overcome having a strong faith, that sometimes you need to demonize that faith in order to
Yeah.
move forward away from it.
Yeah, I'm sure that there was some reactionary elements to it. I mean, today I pretty much just ignore fundamentalism, or if I'm going to get involved in a conversation with them, I'm up for the conversation, but I don't seek it out, or nor do I avoid it.
Mhm.
I,
Do you find
it's
that
just there.
the arguments have changed at all? How about that?
Uh,
Like when you do re-engage with the with fundamentalists, have you seen any change in the landscape?
Not much. The only change in landscape I've seen is the new popularity of presuppositional apologetics,
Okay.
which I find to be absolutely horrendous.
Hmm.
Uh, they're not really apologetics at all, in my opinion. They've painted themselves into a corner where everything is defined by the corner, and anything that disagrees with the corner is just assumed by them to be bogus. And so it's to me, it's a tiny little circle that
Hmm.
is just, um, in a sense, impenetrable to the person who sealed themselves in it. But it's an anti-social concept as far as I'm concerned.
Well, in looking
Yeah.
at the whole
But getting
creationist.
back to though, that was the only change I've really seen. So most of the other old arguments are the same.
Well, what I wanted to get to was, the presuppositional argument is kind of a reaction against all of the evidential arguments that were being used by fundamentalists
Because they
up
were
to that
losing.
point. Well, that's of
Yeah.
course how it is framed by some, um,
Yeah.
and of course they switched game plans, and instead of arguing evidence, they went in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
But so let's go to the evidence arguments. Were they kind of the same? Because like the precept, let's say the argument has been in popularity for what, the past 3 to 5 years, if not more recently than that.
Probably. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
before then, I mean, they were still kind of relying on a lot of like the Kent Hovind arguments, or the Gish, the Dwayne Gish arguments, or the arguments from the Discovery Institute, which is
Right.
Philip Johnson,
Yeah,
and
they try to use their understanding of archaeology, their understanding of confirmed history, their understanding of prophecy, their
hmm
understanding of various scriptures they want to claim can't be understood any other way. Um, I I find the evidentialists to be people who, in order to even feel successful at that, have to be extremely selective in what they consider to be evidence and what they simply dismiss and don't even want to deal with. Uh,
I
they
agree.
and they don't even want to deal with such things as now. Oddly enough, part of the way I became that fundamentalist, I was not raised in a fundamentalist home. had never heard of fundamentalism, had no I in fact, I'd never even seen a Bible until I was 18. I was very much a believer in God from the time I was 7. And for me, it was a very deep sense of the presence of God. And I had no theology at all. I had no idea if he loved, hated, hell, heaven. I didn't know anything about that. Didn't even care. But but part of the way that that also happened was I decided that I really would like to go into the ministry, and I ended up at Bob Jones University. And but prior to that, one of the things I wanted to do, I loved linguistics, and I looked into going to the University of Chicago for
Okay.
but for linguistics. I wanted to go to study where Edward Sapir had taught,
Hmm.
and it was so expensive. It was just beyond me. I couldn't do it, and I decided, well, I wouldn't know where else to go, and I didn't know much, and I had no support from my parents. So, if well, I'm going to become a minister, don't know where to go. I was thinking of going to the seminary that the pastor of the church I was going to went to, but he was having crises of faith, and so that didn't sound all that recommended to me. And I had a girlfriend whose mother went to Bob Jones University, and she would tell me, "Oh no, these people, they know what they believe. They do this and blah blah blah." And and I'm just reading the Bible, and I'm just, "Well, fine, I'll go there." And
Hmm.
that was my introduction to fundamentalism. Young,
Wow.
naive, and I swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, and I really gave it an earnest try. I mean, I just dove in full force, and it wasn't until but by the time I got acclimated, that's when I began asking questions, trying to put things together, and discovered that I, I could not honestly embrace it anymore. Couldn't do it.
Hmm. Well, Bob, I think that we have run out of time.
Woo!
I think the stories that you tell are fascinating. I mean, I hope that I have an opportunity in the future to fill in for Greg again, or to maybe even have you on my show, or to just be able to chew the fat with you in general.
Lots of
Um,
fun.
yeah, this is a good time. So I'm going to sign off. Thank you all, the viewing audience, very much for coming in and checking out the conversation that Bob and I had. And next week, hopefully there will be somebody else to fill in for Greg, because both Greg and I will be on vacation. I'm not quite sure how that's all going to work, or maybe Bob will do the whole show for himself. To be determined. But we will see. We will see you all next week. And thank you very much for hanging out.